After my husband died, his mother looked me dead in the eye and said, "I am taking the house, the law firm, and every penny he left behind. You can keep the kid, though." Everyone, including my own attorney, begged me to fight her in court. Instead, I smiled, packed my bags, and handed over the keys. They thought they had destroyed me. They had no idea I was just handing them the detonator to their own financial ruin. My name is Claire, and at 33 years old, I never expected to be planning a funeral while defending myself against the people who were supposed to be my family. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart toxic relatives who underestimated your intelligence. The scent of wilting white lilies still hung heavy in my living room. The last of the funeral guests had just walked out the front door. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut, and the silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. I was still wearing my black dress, holding my 5-year-old daughter Lily in my arms. She had finally fallen asleep against my shoulder, exhausted from crying for a father she would never see again. I turned around, expecting to see my mother-in-law Beatrice gathering her coat to leave. Instead, she was standing by the fireplace, running her fingers over the expensive marble mantel with a look of absolute ownership. Beatrice was 65 years old and wore her wealth like armor. Her dark, tailored suit was impeccable, and her posture was rigid. She looked like a landlord ready to evict a tenant. She turned to me, her eyes cold and calculating, and delivered her opening blow. "Pack your bags, Claire," she said. "I am taking the house, the law firm, and all of it. Everything my son built belongs to me now. You can keep the kid, though." I stood there, frozen, not out of fear, but out of sheer disbelief at her timing. Ryan had been in the ground for less than 4 hours. The dirt on his grave was not even settled, and his mother was already claiming the territory. I held Lily tighter, taking a slow breath. I told Beatrice she was standing in my home, the home Ryan and I bought together. I told her she could not just tell me to pack my bags. Beatrice let out a sharp, cruel laugh. She told me not to make her laugh on the day of her son's funeral. She claimed this house was bought with Ryan's brilliance because he was a high-powered attorney and a partner at his own firm. Then she looked me up and down and called me a glorified calculator. She said I spent my days staring at spreadsheets for other people's businesses. She accused me of leeching off my son from the day I met him, pretending my little accounting job was anywhere near his level. She called me a gold digger then and a squatter now. Her words were meant to cut me down to size, but they only reminded me of how little she actually knew about me. I am a forensic accountant. I do not just stare at spreadsheets. I uncover hidden assets, expose corporate fraud, and track money trails that people spend their entire lives trying to bury. But Beatrice had always viewed me as the boring number cruncher who dragged down her charismatic golden boy. She never bothered to ask what I actually did at work or how much I got paid. She just assumed that because Ryan wore the flashy suits and drove the sports car, he was the one funding our lifestyle. Beatrice continued gesturing to the high ceilings and the custom hardwood floors, telling me I did not belong in a place like this. She said I tricked him into marrying me by getting pregnant. But she claimed Ryan always knew the truth, and that is why he made sure his real family was protected. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I had spent the last 5 years auditing hostile takeovers and dealing with corporate executives who tried to intimidate me. Beatrice was just another bully with an inflated sense of power. I looked her right in the eye and kept my voice dangerously calm. I reminded her that Ryan died without a will. By law in the state of New York, everything passes to his spouse and his child. I told her she had no legal standing here and was just trespassing. Before Beatrice could answer, the front door swung open again. Heavy footsteps echoed in the foyer. The real invasion was just beginning. My sister-in-law Megan and her husband Jamal, a sharp-dressed African-American realtor, walked into the living room, and they were not there to offer condolences. Jamal smoothed the lapels of his custom suit, a heavy gold watch flashing on his wrist, as his eyes scanned my house like a real estate listing. Megan crossed her arms and glared at me. The vultures had officially arrived to pick the bones clean. Jamal did not even pretend to offer a sympathetic nod. He swaggered past me, his expensive leather shoes clicking sharply against the hardwood floor, and headed straight for the marble kitchen island. He tossed a thick manila folder onto the pristine surface. The loud smack echoed through the quiet house. I watched as he casually unbuttoned his suit jacket, leaning forward with a smug grin that made my stomach turn. "Look, Claire, I am a busy man," Jamal said, checking the heavy gold watch on his wrist. "The market is hot right now, and I do not have time to wait for a long, drawn-out probate process." Ryan knew that. He knew I was the one who could maximize the value of this estate. I stepped closer to the island, keeping Lily tucked securely against my hip. "What are you talking about, Jamal?" I asked, my voice steady despite the anger bubbling in my chest. Jamal slid a single sheet of paper out of the folder and tapped it with his index finger. "This right here is a retroactive power of attorney," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Ryan signed it 2 days before he went into surgery. It gives Beatrice full control over his estate, including his share of the law firm, and most importantly, this property." Megan stepped out from behind her husband, crossing her arms over her chest. Her eyes darted around the room, taking inventory of everything I owned. "That is right, Claire," she snapped. "Ryan finally realized you were incapable of handling real money. He wanted to make sure his legacy stayed with his actual bloodline, not some outsider who just happened to be living here." I looked down at the document lying on the kitchen island. The signature at the bottom was shaky, barely legible, but it looked enough like Ryan's handwriting to pass a quick glance. My mind raced backward to the hospital room. 2 days before his surgery, Ryan was heavily medicated, barely conscious, and completely reliant on a ventilator. There was no physical way he could have comprehended a complex legal document, let alone signed a power of attorney giving away everything we owned. The realization hit me like a physical blow. They had conspired against me. While I was sitting in the hospital cafeteria crying into cold coffee and praying for my husband to survive, his mother and sister were in his room guiding his limp hand across a piece of paper to steal my home. They had planned this hostile takeover while his heart was still beating. Jamal leaned back against the counter, looking extremely pleased. "I already have a cash buyer lined up," he boasted. "A developer from Manhattan looking for a quick flip. We are going to gut this place, rip out that awful wallpaper you picked, and turn a massive profit by next month. So you need to be gone. The faster you clear out, the faster I can get my team in here to work." Megan took a step closer to me, her gaze fixing on the open closet door down the hallway. "And do not think you are packing up half the house either," she demanded. "I know for a fact Ryan bought you those designer bags sitting on the top shelf. My brother's money paid for those. You leave them exactly where they are. You are only taking what you brought into this marriage, which, as I recall, was absolutely nothing at all." I looked at Megan, a woman who had never worked a hard day in her life but felt completely entitled to the fruits of my labor. "I bought those bags with my own bonuses, but I did not bother explaining that to her." Arguing with Megan was always a total waste of breath. Beatrice finally spoke up. "Listen to them, Claire," she said, stepping up to stand beside her daughter and son-in-law. "We hold all the cards. If you try to drag this into a messy court battle, I will drag your name through the mud. I will make sure every judge knows you are an unfit mother who tried to steal my son's wealth. Do not make this harder than it has to be." They formed a solid wall against me. 3 greedy people standing in the center of my kitchen, demanding I surrender everything I worked for. My fingers tightened around Lily. Any normal wife would have grabbed that forged document and torn it into pieces. I could have fought them tooth and nail for every dollar and every square inch of hardwood floor. But as I looked at Jamal's smug face, Megan's greedy eyes, and Beatrice's triumphant smirk, a different plan began to take shape. I shifted Lily's weight in my arms and took a step back from the marble island. I looked at the 3 of them standing there like conquerors, expecting me to fall to my knees and beg. I could see the anticipation burning in their eyes. They wanted a screaming match. They wanted me to throw a hysterical fit so they could call the police and have me dragged out of my own house looking like a deranged woman. They wanted to prove to themselves that I was exactly the desperate gold digger they always claimed I was. I refused to give them the satisfaction. Instead, I took a deep breath, smoothed Lily's hair, and looked directly at Beatrice. "You want it?" I asked, my voice perfectly level. "Fine. You can have it. All of it. I will be packed and out of here by tomorrow morning." The room went completely silent. Jamal's smug smile faltered instantly. Megan's arms dropped to her sides in shock. Beatrice just stared at me, her eyes narrowing in deep suspicion. This was not the reaction they had prepared for. They had brought forged documents and rehearsed vicious insults ready for a brutal legal war over a multi-million-dollar estate. They had geared up for a battle that I was simply refusing to fight. My sudden surrender caught them completely off guard. "What did you just say?" Beatrice asked, stepping forward, as if her hearing had failed her. "I said you can have it," I repeated clearly and slowly, emphasizing every single word. "The house, the law firm, the assets. If Ryan signed that paper, then it belongs to you. I will not fight you for it. I will take my daughter and my personal belongings, and I will leave you to your inheritance." Megan scoffed loudly, trying desperately to recover her aggressive momentum. "Oh, please," she sneered, stepping closer to me. "Do not act like you are taking the high road, Claire. You just know you cannot afford a high-powered lawyer to fight us. You know you are backed into a corner, so you are running away with your tail between your legs." I turned away from her and started walking toward the staircase. My silence infuriated Megan. She hated being ignored more than anything else in the world. She followed me to the bottom of the stairs, her voice raising to a shrill, grating pitch. "And another thing," Megan yelled, her voice echoing harshly through the foyer. "We all know Ryan was too smart to leave everything to you anyway. Mom and I always wondered if that kid was even his. You probably trapped him with some other man's baby just to get your hands on his wallet." I stopped dead on the second step. My knuckles turned stark white as I gripped the wooden banister. Every maternal instinct in my body screamed at me to turn around and physically remove Megan from my house. Questioning the paternity of my grieving 5-year-old daughter, just hours after we buried her father, was a new level of depravity even for them. Lily stirred against my shoulder, whimpering softly in her sleep. I closed my eyes and forced myself to breathe, counting slowly to 3. If I lost my temper now, I would ruin the entire plan. I had to let them think they were the smartest people in the room. I had to let them gorge themselves on their own unchecked greed. They needed to feel victorious. I did not turn around. I simply continued walking up the stairs, leaving Megan's toxic words hanging in the empty air. I could hear Jamal laughing downstairs, telling Megan to let it go because they had already won the jackpot. I heard Beatrice loudly dictating how they would arrange the furniture once my cheap things were thrown out on the lawn. Once I was safely inside my bedroom, I locked the heavy wooden door and gently laid Lily down on the bed. She was fast asleep, her tear-stained cheeks resting on the soft pillow. I sat on the edge of the mattress, pulling out my phone. Any sane person watching this unfold would think I was out of my mind. Why would a widow surrender a massive suburban estate and a lucrative law firm to her abusive in-laws without a single legal objection? Why would I let them walk all over me and insult my child without fighting back? What Beatrice, Megan, and Jamal did not understand was that wealth is a complete illusion if you do not know how to read the actual ledger. They looked at the grand house and saw a $1 million asset ripe for the taking. They looked at the law firm and saw an empire of prestige and endless cash flow. They were completely blinded by the glamorous surface. But I was a forensic accountant. I did not look at the surface. I looked at the hidden debts, the buried liabilities, and the terrifying numbers that people desperately tried to hide in the dark. Ryan had a lot of ugly secrets. He played the part of the wealthy, successful lawyer perfectly to the outside world. But I knew exactly what was holding his fragile house of cards together. By slamming that forged power of attorney on my counter, they thought they were stealing a gold mine. They had absolutely no idea they had just aggressively volunteered to catch a falling safe. My cell phone buzzed violently against the nightstand, vibrating against the polished wood. The caller ID flashed David's name. David was 55 years old, a seasoned estate attorney, and one of the few people Ryan had ever truly respected. He had been our family lawyer for years, but more importantly, he was a good man. I picked up the phone, and before I could even say hello, his voice exploded through the speaker. "Claire, what on earth is happening?" he shouted. His voice was laced with pure panic. "I just got an email from Richard, that snake of a lawyer Beatrice keeps on retainer. He sent over a copy of a power of attorney, claiming Ryan signed it 48 hours before his surgery. Claire, that is legally impossible. Ryan was heavily sedated on a ventilator. A medical expert would throw this fraudulent document straight into the shredder. Tell me you are fighting this." I walked over to the bedroom window and peeked through the blinds. Down in the driveway, Jamal was already pacing back and forth, talking loudly on his cell phone, probably negotiating a contractor fee. I turned my attention back to the phone. "David, I am not fighting it," I said. My voice was eerily calm compared to his frantic shouting. "I told them they can have the house and the law firm. I am packing my bags and leaving in the morning." There was a heavy silence. When David spoke, he sounded horrified. "Claire, listen to me," he pleaded. "You are grieving and not thinking straight. If you walk away now, you are giving up millions of dollars. You are letting them steal your daughter's future. We can take this to court tomorrow morning. I can file an injunction and freeze every single asset. I will lock them out before they even get a chance to breathe. Please let me protect you." I sat down on the edge of the bed, keeping my voice low. "David, I appreciate you wanting to protect me," I said. "But you need to trust me. If we file an injunction, they will hire forensic experts to comb through Ryan's accounts for a trial. If we fight, they will look closely at what they are actually fighting for. I cannot let that happen. I need them moving too fast to check the blind spots. I need them blinded by their own greed." David let out a frustrated sigh. Blinded by greed, he repeated, "Claire, they are stealing a multi-million-dollar estate. So, what exactly are they blind to?" Instead of answering, I stood up and walked into my master closet. I pushed aside heavy winter coats to reveal a small digital safe bolted into the wall. I punched in my passcode, and the heavy steel door clicked open. Inside was a thick black leather binder. I pulled it out and flipped it open. The first page bore the bold printed logo of a private equity limited liability company called Apex Holding. David said into the phone, "How much do you really know about Ryan's firm? You handled his estate planning, but did you ever look at his operational ledgers?" David admitted he only handled personal trust documents, not business accounting. "That is what I thought," I replied. Ryan was a fantastic trial lawyer, but he was a catastrophic businessman. And he had a severe gambling problem he successfully hid from everyone except his forensic accountant wife. I stared at the ledger, detailing massive off-the-book loans. When Ryan realized his firm was drowning, he panicked. He took out predatory loans using the firm as collateral. When those ran dry, he needed a private bailout. He was desperate, so I gave him one. David was dead silent. "What did you do, Claire?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I closed the black binder, running my hand over the embossed Apex Holding logo. "I set up a perfectly legal, fully insulated private equity firm," I explained, "and I used it to lend my husband $4.5 million to keep his firm afloat. Ryan signed the loan documents binding his company to the debt. He never knew I was the one pulling the strings behind the LLC. So if Beatrice takes the firm," David stammered, finally putting the pieces together. "If Beatrice takes the firm, she takes the massive debt," I confirmed. "But right now, she only sees the shiny mahogany desks and the prestige. If we fight her, she will look at the books and run away. I need her to officially claim the empire before she realizes the castle is on fire." I hung up the phone, ready for tomorrow. The morning sun barely crested the horizon when the harsh grinding sound of a power drill shattered the quiet of the house. It was exactly 8 o'clock. I had been up since 4, packing the last of Lily's clothes and my essential documents into 2 medium-sized suitcases. I zipped the final bag shut and walked out into the hallway just as the heavy oak front door swung open. Jamal stood in the foyer, a steaming cup of expensive coffee in one hand and his cell phone pressed against his ear. Next to him, a man in gray overalls was already aggressively drilling into the brass deadbolt I had installed just 2 years ago. Jamal did not even look at me as I descended the stairs. He was too busy pacing across the imported rugs, boasting loudly to whoever was on the other end of the line. "Listen to me, man," Jamal said, his voice booming through the empty house. "I need your crew in here by Monday morning. We are tearing out this entire first floor. I am talking an open concept, knocking down the load-bearing wall in the kitchen and putting in floor-to-ceiling windows. This property sits on an acre of prime suburban real estate. With the right cosmetic upgrades, I am looking at $1 million profit margin by the end of the quarter. Yes, you heard me, a cool $1 million. I reached the bottom of the stairs and set the suitcases down with a dull thud. Jamal snapped his fingers at the locksmith, pointing to the back door to indicate he wanted that lock changed next. Then he finally ended his call, slipped the phone into his tailored suit pocket, and turned his attention to me. He flashed a brilliant, condescending smile. "Morning, Claire," he said, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "You are moving a little slow today. I thought I told you to be out of here by the time I arrived." I glanced at the locksmith, who was actively removing the internal mechanics of my front door. "You are changing the locks while I'm still inside the house, Jamal?" I asked, keeping my tone conversational. "That seems a bit premature even for you." Jamal took a step closer, invading my personal space. He used his height to try and physically intimidate me, looking down his nose with an expression of pure arrogance. "It is not your house anymore, Claire. The paperwork is moving through probate as we speak. Beatrice gave me full authorization to secure the premises and begin renovations. The way I see it, you are currently trespassing on a private construction site." I crossed my arms and held his gaze. "You cannot legally evict a widow in less than 24 hours, Jamal, not even with a forged power of attorney." His smile vanished, replaced by a hard, menacing glare. "Do not throw legal words around like you know how the real world works," he sneered. "You spent your life hiding behind a desk, crunching numbers for people who actually make moves. I am a licensed realtor. I know property law. And I know that if I call the local precinct right now and tell them a disgruntled ex-family member is refusing to vacate my client's property, they will send a squad car to escort you out. It will not look good for the neighbors to see you and Lily dragged onto the lawn by uniformed officers." He tapped his expensive watch. "I will give you exactly 10 minutes to grab your kid and get off my property. After that, I make the call." I looked at his gold watch, his custom suit, and the sheer confidence radiating from his posture. He genuinely believed he had outsmarted me. He believed his aggressive tactics had bullied a weak, grieving widow into submission. He thought this house was his golden ticket to early retirement. He was already spending the $1 million profit margin in his head. He had no idea that beneath the beautiful hardwood floors he was standing on an environmental nightmare was silently waiting. He had no idea that by taking aggressive physical possession of the property and claiming to be the authorized developer, he was walking right into the crosshairs of federal liability. I did not argue. I did not beg for more time. I simply nodded. "10 minutes is plenty of time, Jamal," I said softly. "I will go wake Lily up." I turned my back on him and walked back up the stairs. Behind me, I could hear him chuckling a low, victorious sound. He told the locksmith to hurry up because the trash was finally taking itself out. I let him have his moment of glory. Every arrogant word he spoke just made the trap tighter. I walked into the master bedroom and gently shook Lily awake. She rubbed her sleepy eyes, asking where her daddy was. My heart broke all over again, but I forced a warm smile and told her we were going on an adventure. I helped her slip on her sneakers, grabbed the 2 suitcases I had packed earlier, and guided her out into the hallway. As I reached the bottom of the stairs for the second time, Megan burst through the front door. She marched straight toward me, her face twisted into an ugly scowl. Before I could even react, she snatched the handles of both suitcases right out of my hands. She dragged them roughly across the foyer, the plastic wheels loudly scraping against the imported hardwood floor. "Megan, what are you doing?" I asked, keeping Lily safely behind my legs. Megan did not answer immediately. She hauled the bags out the open front door and down the front steps. Jamal stood on the porch watching with quiet amusement as his wife threw both suitcases onto the concrete driveway. With a vicious yank, Megan unzipped the main compartments and tipped them upside down. My clothes, Lily's toys, and my carefully folded sweaters spilled out onto the cold, hard pavement. "You are not leaving here with a single thing my brother paid for?" Megan shouted, her voice echoing down the quiet suburban street. She kicked a pile of my clothes, scattering them further across the concrete. "You always acted like you were better than us just because you work with numbers. You sat at our Thanksgiving tables judging how we spent our money, acting like some financial genius. Well, let me tell you a secret, Claire. Ryan hated being married to a boring auditor. He told me himself. He was sick of you constantly questioning his spending and acting like you owned his success." I stood on the porch holding Lily's small hand. Megan's words were designed to humiliate me in front of the neighbors who were undoubtedly peeking through their curtains by now. She wanted me to fall to my knees on the driveway crying over my scattered belongings. She wanted me to beg for the designer dresses and the expensive shoes that were currently resting on the dirty concrete. Instead, I let out a soft, tired sigh. I walked down the steps and knelt on the driveway. I did not reach for the silk blouses or the cashmere sweaters. I ignored the small velvet jewelry box that had tumbled out containing diamond earrings and a gold necklace Ryan had bought me for our anniversary. Those pieces alone were worth thousands of dollars. I calmly reached into the pile and picked up my silver laptop. I tucked it safely under my arm. Then I gathered Lily's small folded t-shirts, her favorite stuffed bear, and her pajamas. I placed them into a canvas tote bag I had slung over my shoulder. I stood back up, leaving a mountain of expensive clothing and jewelry scattered on the driveway. Megan stared at me, her chest heaving from her little tantrum. Her eyes darted from me to the jewelry box on the ground, and then back to my face. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her tone shifting from aggressive to completely confused. "I am packing," I replied plainly. "You are leaving all of this?" Megan asked, pointing a shaking finger at the velvet box and the designer coats. "There is easily $50,000 worth of stuff right here. You are just going to walk away from it." I looked at the pile of luxury items. To Megan, those things represented ultimate success. To me, they represented Ryan's desperate attempts to buy my silence whenever I questioned his erratic finances. Every designer bag and diamond necklace was just a physical manifestation of his guilt. I did not want them. Furthermore, by leaving them behind, I was solidifying the illusion that I was walking away completely defeated and terrified. "Keep it, Megan," I said, my voice steady and devoid of any emotion. "You always wanted to wear my clothes anyway. Consider it a parting gift." Jamal stepped off the porch, his brow furrowed in deep suspicion. He looked at the discarded jewelry, and then at the modest tote bag hanging from my shoulder. It made no sense to him. A gold digger would be fighting tooth and nail for the diamonds. A desperate woman would be clawing at the cashmere. My absolute indifference was a puzzle they could not solve. I took Lily's hand and walked toward my modest sedan parked on the street. Megan and Jamal remained standing on the driveway staring at the pile of wealth I had just abandoned like it was absolute garbage. They thought they had won the ultimate victory by stripping me of my possessions. They had no idea that the only thing of actual value I was taking with me was the digital ledger sitting inside my laptop. I stopped on the driveway. I told Jamal I had to leave the house keys inside. I needed Lily's water bottle from the fridge. Jamal narrowed his eyes but stepped aside to let me pass. He followed me inside, hovering over my shoulder like a prison guard, making sure I stole nothing. We walked into the kitchen. The marble island was entirely empty. I grabbed the pink water bottle. Closing the fridge, I reached into my pocket. My fingers brushed a crumpled envelope. It was the official notice I received recently. The letter that changed everything. I pulled it out, ensuring the government seal was visible before I crumpled it further. I tossed it into the trash can. I made it look like a desperate attempt to hide evidence. I knew exactly how Jamal's mind worked. To a greedy man, a secretly discarded envelope meant hidden cash or a secret bank statement. "Hold on a second," Jamal barked, stepping forward. "What did you just throw away?" "Nothing," I replied quickly, feigning panic. I stepped to block the trash can. "Just some old junk mail. It is nothing important." "Move," Jamal commanded. He forcefully pushed me out of the way. "You are not destroying any financial documents, Claire. Everything in this house belongs to Beatrice now. If you are hiding assets, I will have you arrested for fraud." He pulled the crumpled envelope from the trash. He smoothed it out with greedy anticipation. He expected to find a treasure map. Instead, he stared at the bold blue letters. EPA, Environmental Protection Agency. Jamal scoffed with pure disgust. Environmental Protection Agency, he read aloud, his tone dripping with disappointment. "What is this garbage?" "It is just a notice about the soil," I lied, my voice trembling slightly to keep up the act. "Ryan was looking into it before he died. I just wanted to throw it away so I would not have to think about it anymore." Jamal laughed loudly, a harsh, booming sound that echoed in the empty kitchen. "A notice about the soil," he mocked. "You really are pathetic, Claire. You are getting kicked out of $1 million estate and you are worried about the dirt in the backyard. You probably wanted to plant some organic tomatoes or something. Let me tell you how real estate works. We are going to pave over whatever little garden you wanted and pour solid concrete for a luxury patio. Nobody cares about an environmental notice." He aggressively crumpled the letter back into a ball and threw it directly at my chest. It bounced off my coat and hit the floor. He did not bother opening it. He did not bother reading the urgent warning printed inside. If he had just taken 2 seconds to tear open the flap, he would have read about the illegal chemical dumping ground buried directly beneath his feet. He would have seen the mandatory federal cleanup order. But Jamal was too arrogant to read the fine print. He was too obsessed with the shiny surface to look at the rot underneath. "Now give me the house keys," Jamal demanded, holding out his open palm. I reached into my purse, pulled out the heavy brass ring and dropped it into his hand. He gripped the keys like they were a gold medal. I picked up Lily's water bottle and walked out of the kitchen without another word. I stepped out the front door and walked down the driveway toward my car. Megan was still standing near the pile of my discarded clothes, admiring one of my expensive handbags. I ignored her entirely. I opened the rear door of my sedan and carefully buckled Lily into her car seat. I handed her the water bottle and kissed her forehead, telling her everything was going to be perfectly fine. I got into the driver's seat and started the engine. The motor purred to life. I shifted into drive but paused for just a second to look in the rearview mirror. Jamal had stepped out onto the front porch, tossing the house keys up and catching them in his hand. He wrapped his arm around Megan, grinning from ear to ear. They looked like the undisputed rulers of their new kingdom. They thought they had successfully bullied a weak widow out of her fortune. I slowly let my foot off the brake. As my car rolled down the suburban street, leaving the massive brick colonial behind, I finally let the mask fall. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. Jamal had just taken physical possession of the property. He had claimed full authority over the renovations. By tossing that letter aside, he had unknowingly cemented his own doom. The trap was set, and they were already standing inside the cage. Less than an hour after my car disappeared down the street, Jamal wasted absolutely no time. He unlocked the front door and walked into the house like a conquering king. Megan followed close behind him, already taking pictures of the living room to post on her social media. Jamal pulled out his phone and immediately dialed his lead contractor. He wanted the demolition crew in the house by the afternoon. He was obsessed with the idea of turning a rapid profit, and nothing was going to slow him down. 30 minutes later, a heavy white work van pulled into the driveway right over the spot where my clothes had been scattered. A burly man in his late 40s, wearing steel-toed boots and a faded work shirt stepped out. His name was Tom, and he had worked on several of Jamal's previous real estate flips. Tom grabbed his heavy tool belt and a clipboard, walking up to the front porch where Jamal was waiting with a triumphant grin. Jamal shook his hand and immediately launched into his grand vision. He walked Tom through the foyer, pointing at the walls he wanted completely torn down. He talked about importing Italian marble for the kitchen and installing a massive glass wall overlooking the backyard. Tom nodded along, taking quick notes on his clipboard. But Tom was a seasoned professional. He knew that before they could knock down load-bearing walls on the first floor, they needed to inspect the structural integrity of the basement foundation. They walked down the narrow wooden stairs into the dark, unfinished basement. The air down there was damp and carried a faint, unusual odor, but Jamal barely noticed it. He was too busy calculating his future millions. Tom turned on a heavy-duty portable work light, illuminating the gray concrete walls and the solid slab floor. He told Jamal he needed to drill a few test holes into the foundation to check for moisture and measure the concrete thickness before they brought in the heavy steel support beams. Jamal leaned against the wooden staircase, crossing his arms. He told Tom to do whatever he needed to do, but to do it fast. Tom retrieved a massive rotary hammer drill from his equipment bag. He plugged it into a portable generator and positioned the heavy carbide drill bit against the center of the concrete floor. The loud, deafening roar of the drill echoed violently off the basement walls. Dust kicked up into the air as the bit bit into the thick concrete slab. For the first few inches, everything seemed perfectly normal. But as the drill bit plunged deeper, the sound of the motor suddenly changed. It pitched down, laboring against something unexpectedly soft. A second later, a thick, black substance began bubbling up around the spinning metal. Tom released the trigger instantly. The loud, grinding noise died away, leaving a heavy silence in the room. The smell hit them almost immediately. It was not the familiar smell of damp earth or old pipes. It was a sharp, acidic stench that burned the back of the throat. It smelled like industrial solvent mixed with rotting chemicals and burnt oil. Tom coughed violently, waving his hand in front of his face. He knelt down, shining his flashlight directly onto the drill hole. The black sludge was actively seeping out, pooling onto the gray concrete like thick, toxic blood. Jamal covered his nose and mouth with his expensive suit sleeve. "What is that?" he demanded, his voice muffled. "Did you hit a sewage line? I told you to be careful down here." Tom shook his head, his face completely pale. "That is not sewage, Jamal," he said, his voice tight with sudden panic. "That is chemical runoff." This whole subdivision was built on land that used to be an industrial manufacturing zone decades ago. I have seen this once before in a commercial zone. The soil underneath this foundation is severely contaminated. The concrete slab was the only thing keeping it sealed. Jamal rolled his eyes, stepping back from the expanding black puddle. "So what?" he snapped impatiently. "Just patch the hole and pour another layer of concrete over the entire floor. Problem solved. We are finishing this basement with hardwood anyway." Tom stood up, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked at Jamal like he had lost his mind. "You do not understand," he warned. "This is an environmental hazard. The fumes alone could make the future buyers incredibly sick. By law, we have to stop all work immediately and report this to the federal authorities. They will bring in a hazmat team to excavate the entire property. It will cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to clean up." Jamal's eyes went wide with pure fury. He grabbed Tom by the collar of his work shirt, shoving him hard against the wooden staircase. "You are not reporting anything to anybody," Jamal snarled, his voice dripping with venom. "I just took ownership of this property today. I am not letting some dirt ruin my $1 million flip. You are going to seal that hole right now, and you are going to keep your mouth shut." Tom pushed him away, shaking his head. "I cannot do that, Jamal. I could lose my contractor's license or go to federal prison for covering this up." Jamal stepped into his personal space, pointing a threatening finger at his chest. "If you walk out that door and make a phone call, I will personally destroy your business," Jamal hissed. "I know every developer in this city. I will make sure you never get a single contract again. You will be bankrupt by next month. Now grab your cement mix and fix it." Tom stared at him, breathing heavily. The toxic fumes were already making his eyes water. Reluctantly, he looked down at the black sludge spreading across the floor. He knew Jamal was ruthless enough to ruin him. Defeated, Tom slowly reached into his bag for the patching compound. Jamal smiled, wiping his hands together, thinking he had won again. He had absolutely no idea the problem was far too massive to simply bury. While Jamal was busy sealing his own fate in the dark basement of my former home, Beatrice was making her own aggressive moves across town. Ryan had leased a massive office space in one of the most expensive high-rise buildings in downtown Manhattan. The firm occupied the entire 40th floor, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. It was designed to project absolute wealth. Beatrice stepped out of the private elevator wearing a sharp designer suit and heavy pearls. She walked through the double glass doors bearing the firm name with her head held high. She did not look like a grieving mother. She looked like a corporate raider arriving to claim her spoils. Behind the sleek reception desk sat a young woman named Emily. Emily had worked for Ryan for 3 years. When she saw Beatrice step off the elevator, Emily stood up, offering a sympathetic smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Beatrice," Emily said softly. "I am so sorry for your loss." Beatrice did not smile back. She walked up to the reception desk, slamming her expensive handbag down onto the polished surface. "Save the fake tears," Beatrice snapped coldly. "I am the new majority owner of this firm, which means I am now your boss." Beatrice did not give her a chance to process the hostile takeover. "I never liked you," Beatrice continued, her voice echoing through the lobby. "Pack up your desk and be out of this building in 15 minutes. You are officially fired." Emily burst into tears, but Beatrice simply marched down the main hallway. She fired a loyal employee within 30 seconds of arriving, just to establish absolute dominance. Beatrice pushed open the heavy mahogany doors to Ryan's corner office. She walked behind the massive custom desk and sat down in the high-backed leather executive chair. She spun around once, taking in the breathtaking view of the city below. She was intoxicated by the illusion of power. A gentle knock on the open door broke her concentration. Standing in the doorway was Gregory, the senior accountant for the firm. Gregory knew every single number that flowed through the business. He looked exhausted and deeply stressed, holding a thick stack of red folders against his chest. "Come in, Gregory," Beatrice commanded, leaning back in the leather chair. "I want to see the master bank accounts. I want the routing numbers, the passwords, and the current liquid balances. Bring me the paperwork to transfer the primary signing authority directly to my name." Gregory walked into the office hesitantly, placing the heavy red folders on the edge of the desk. "Mrs. Beatrice," Gregory started, his voice trembling slightly. "First, I want to express my deepest condolences for Ryan, but we have an urgent financial situation that requires your immediate attention. As the new legal owner, you need to review these pending liabilities today." Beatrice let out a sharp, annoyed sigh. She pushed the red folders back toward him without opening the covers. "I do not care about your petty operational expenses, Gregory," she scolded harshly. "I am not interested in reading about the paperclip budget. I only care about the master accounts. My son was bringing in millions of dollars a year in retainer fees. I know there is a massive cash reserve sitting in those accounts. I want access to my money right now." Gregory swallowed hard, sweat beading on his forehead. "Mrs. Beatrice, you do not understand," he pleaded desperately. "The firm is currently facing severe structural debt. Ryan took out several massive loans, and there are immediate corporate liabilities due by the end of this week. If we do not address these deficits immediately, the firm will face catastrophic default." Beatrice slammed her hand flat against the desk, making Gregory jump. "Do not tell me how to run my business," she shouted, her face turning red. "I know exactly how much wealth is in this company. You are just a glorified bookkeeper trying to justify your paycheck. You will give me the bank access codes right now, or I will have security throw you out of this building next to that weeping receptionist." Gregory stared at her wide-eyed and terrified. He realized in that exact moment that Beatrice was completely delusional. She was blinded by her own greed, and entirely unwilling to listen to reason. Defeated, Gregory slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black flash drive. He placed it silently on the desk in front of her. Beatrice snatched it up with a triumphant smirk. She told Gregory to get out of her office. As the wooden door clicked shut, Beatrice plugged the drive into the computer, eager to count her millions. She had absolutely no idea she had just locked herself inside a burning building. While Beatrice was admiring her reflection in the firm windows, my legal battle was just beginning. 2 days later, we gathered for the first mediation at the downtown office of Richard. Richard was 50 and built his reputation as a ruthless corporate shark. His office was specifically designed to intimidate every opposing counsel. It sat on the top floor of a glass high-rise featuring a massive mahogany conference table and expensive modern art. He wore a custom suit and a smug expression matching Jamal's arrogance perfectly. I sat on one side of the table with my attorney David. Across from us sat the victorious trio. Beatrice was in the center looking exactly like a queen holding court. Jamal sat to her right, checking his watch, while Megan sat to her left, aggressively filing her nails. They looked incredibly relaxed. They thought this meeting was a mere formality before they could fully cash in on their stolen inheritance. Richard did not bother offering water or coffee. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a dense stack of legal documents. He tossed them onto the center of the table with a thud. He slid the top packet across the polished wood until it stopped in front of David. "That is a forced transfer agreement," Richard said, leaning back in his leather chair. "It officially relinquishes any claims Claire might have against Ryan's estate, his properties, and his law firm. It legally transfers full ownership to Beatrice and Jamal, just as my client intends. I suggest your client signs it immediately right now so we can move on with our lives." David picked up the document, adjusting his glasses. He read the first few paragraphs, and I could see his face turning red with anger. David was a calm, methodical man, but he had a low tolerance for legal bullying. He dropped the packet back onto the table. "Are you out of your mind, Richard?" David asked, his voice rising. "This document is a complete joke. You are asking my client to walk away from millions in marital assets based on a questionable power of attorney that Ryan allegedly signed while heavily medicated on a ventilator. A first-year law student could get this thrown out of court." Richard let out a patronizing laugh. He looked at David like he was a naive child. "The document is perfectly legal, David. We have 2 witnesses who will testify that Ryan was completely lucid when he signed it." David slammed his hand flat against the mahogany table. The loud crack made Megan drop her nail file. "You and I both know those witnesses were handpicked by Beatrice," David shouted, leaning aggressively across the table. "I am not letting Claire sign away her life. If you try to push this forced transfer through, I will file an immediate injunction. I will demand a comprehensive forensic audit of the entire estate. We will freeze every bank account, every property deed, and every corporate asset. We will drag this out in probate court for 5 years, and I promise a judge will tear this fraudulent document to shreds." Beatrice gasped dramatically, placing a hand over her pearl necklace. Jamal sat up straight, his easy demeanor vanishing. An audit and a frozen estate meant he could not sell the house. It meant his $1 million flip would be put on hold. But Richard simply laughed. It was a cold, calculating sound. He leaned forward and stared directly at David. "You have no idea who you are dealing with, do you?" "David?" Richard sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "You are a small-time family lawyer. You write basic wills and handle petty divorces. You are essentially a third-rate public defender trying to swim with the sharks. Go ahead and demand your audit. All it will do is prove Claire contributed absolutely nothing to the marriage. It will prove she was just a leech draining my client's wealth. And when we win, I will personally sue you for every dime of your legal fees for filing a frivolous injunction." David opened his mouth to fire back, but I gently placed my hand on his arm. I needed to stop him before he ruined my plan. David was fighting bravely, but he did not understand I actually wanted them to have the assets. If David filed an injunction, Richard would be forced to open the accounting books. If Richard opened the books, he would instantly see the massive debt. I needed Richard exactly as he was, arrogant, overconfident, and completely blind. I looked across the table, playing the part of the terrified and helpless widow. I sat in silence, watching them blindly and eagerly take the trap we were carefully setting right in front of all of them. My silence hung heavily in the air of the polished conference room. Beatrice misinterpreted my quiet observation as a final desperate act of defiance. She thought I was silently calculating a way to steal her imaginary fortune. She decided it was time to crush whatever resistance she believed I had left. Beatrice cleared her throat, adjusting the heavy pearl necklace resting against her expensive designer suit. She looked at Richard and gave him a slow, deliberate nod. Richard reached into his imported leather briefcase and pulled out a second document. It was much thinner than the first one, but the weight of it in the room was suffocating. Richard slid the new file across the long mahogany table. It stopped right next to the forced transfer agreement. This document was not about real estate or corporate shares. It had my 5-year-old daughter's name printed boldly across the top page. David reached out and picked it up. He read the title and his face instantly drained of color. He dropped the paper back onto the table like it was physically burning his hands. He looked across the table at Beatrice with absolute unmasked disgust. David told her she had finally crossed a line of human decency that she could never uncross. Beatrice completely ignored David. She locked her cold eyes directly onto mine. She told me it was a formal petition for emergency grandparents' rights. She explained that if I refused to sign away the house and the law firm today, she would file that petition in family court the very next morning. Beatrice leaned forward, resting her manicured hands on the table. She said she would stand before a judge and swear under oath that I was mentally unstable. She would claim I was suffering from hysterical grief and completely unfit to raise a young child. Megan chimed in quickly, her voice dripping with venomous delight. She pointed out that I did not even have a permanent residence. She reminded me that they had rightfully reclaimed the family home, so I was now technically homeless. Megan smiled a wicked, satisfied smile and said, "No family court judge in the state of New York would ever let an unemployed, displaced widow keep a child when a wealthy, prominent grandmother was offering a massive, stable mansion and endless financial support." Jamal let out a low, booming chuckle. He leaned back in his expensive leather chair and crossed his arms over his custom suit. He looked at me like a predator, examining a cornered animal. Jamal told me I was playing a losing game. He said they had the money, the powerful lawyers, and the ultimate leverage. He advised me to be a smart girl for once in my life and sign the financial papers so I could keep my kid. He said a boring accountant like me could never outsmart a room full of real estate and legal experts. This was the exact moment I had been waiting for. I had to deliver the performance of a lifetime. I forced my breathing to become shallow and ragged. I let my eyes widen in sheer panic, staring at the document with Lily's name on it. I reached down and grabbed the leather straps of my purse, gripping them so tightly my knuckles turned stark white. I allowed my hands to shake visibly, rattling the metal hardware on my bag. I looked at David with wide, terrified eyes, acting as though my entire universe was collapsing right in front of my face. "Please," I whispered, my voice trembling perfectly, "you cannot take Lily. She is all I have left in this world. Ryan just died. You cannot take my baby away from me." I let a single tear slip down my cheek. It was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation, and they bought every single second of it. Beatrice smiled a cold, triumphant smile. She leaned back in her chair, looking down her nose at me. She explicitly told me she had no actual desire to raise a 5-year-old child at her age. She said Lily was noisy and messy and reminded her entirely too much of my common low-class background. But Beatrice made it absolutely clear that she would take my daughter away and send her to a strict boarding school across the country if I dared to fight for a single penny of Ryan's money. David was furious. He slammed his fist on the table, shouting that this was textbook extortion and blackmail. He threatened to call the police and report Richard to the state ethics board immediately. David was fully prepared to go to absolute war for me. but I shrank back into my chair, acting completely broken and defeated. I let out a loud, dramatic sob and buried my face in my trembling hands. Through the narrow gaps between my fingers, I watched Jamal and Megan exchange a highly victorious glance. They were absolutely reveling in my perceived weakness. They thought they had finally broken the stubborn accountant. They believed a mother's desperate fear had just handed them the keys to a multi-million-dollar empire. I slowly lowered my hands from my face, making sure my shoulders slumped in utter defeat. I took a ragged, shaky breath and looked directly into Beatrice's cold, triumphant eyes. "You win," I whispered, my voice barely audible in the quiet conference room. I wiped a stray tear from my cheek, smearing my mascara, just enough to look genuinely desperate. "Just please do not take my daughter. Leave Lily out of this. I will do whatever you want." Beatrice leaned back, her expression softening into a mask of smug satisfaction. "I knew you would eventually see reason, Claire," she said, adjusting her pearl necklace again. "It is simply the natural order of things. Ryan's legacy belongs to his bloodline, not to you." I nodded rapidly, acting like a frantic cornered animal willing to chew off its own leg to escape. "I will sign the forced transfer agreement today," I said, my voice trembling. "I will surrender my claim to the house. I will give up my spousal rights to the law firm. I will walk away from every single asset, every bank account, and every piece of property tied to Ryan's estate. You can have all of it, unconditionally." Jamal let out a loud whoop of victory, slapping his hand hard on the mahogany table. "That is what I am talking about," he cheered, shooting a massive grin at Megan. Megan crossed her arms and rolled her eyes, muttering that it was about time I stopped being so greedy. "David," my lawyer turned to me with a look of absolute horror. "Claire, no!" he hissed, grabbing my arm. "You cannot do this. You are signing away your entire future based on an empty threat. I can fight that custody petition. I can win it." I shook my head violently, pulling my arm away from David's grip. "I cannot risk it, David." I cried loudly enough for everyone in the room to hear. "Beatrice has millions of dollars and I have nothing. She will drag me through family court until I am bankrupt, and then she will take my baby anyway. I am not fighting. I am giving them exactly what they want." I turned my attention back to Richard, the arrogant shark lawyer sitting across the table. "But I have one condition," I stated, my tone shifting slightly from fearful to cautiously firm. "If I am giving up millions of dollars in assets, I need one specific legal protection in return." Richard raised an eyebrow, his pen hovering over his legal pad. "And what exactly would that be?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. I swallowed hard, playing the part of the anxious, hyper-vigilant accountant perfectly. I know Ryan was successful. I started hesitantly, but I also know how aggressive his legal practice was. He handled high-stakes, corporate litigation and messy divorces. He had enemies. I have always been terrified of his clients coming back to sue him for malpractice or breach of contract. I leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table. "If I sign this transfer, giving Beatrice the entire firm, I need to be completely legally severed from it. I need absolute immunity. I want an assumption of liability, and as-is transfer clause added to this agreement." Richard narrowed his eyes, studying me closely. Jamal scoffed loudly. "What does that even mean?" Jamal asked, waving his hand dismissively. "It means," I explained, keeping my voice small and nervous, "that Beatrice and you accept the estate exactly as it is right now. It means you assume full responsibility for any future lawsuits, any hidden property damage, and any debts Ryan might have incurred. I want it explicitly written that I am shielded from Ryan's past clients and his business liabilities. I want zero ties to anything my husband touched. If a former client tries to sue the firm next year, I do not want them coming after my personal savings." Beatrice let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Listen to yourself, Claire," she sneered. "You are walking away from an empire because you are terrified of a few phantom lawsuits. This is exactly why Ryan never respected you. You have absolutely no stomach for real business. You are a coward." Richard chuckled along with her, shaking his head in amusement. He looked at me like I was the most pathetic creature he had ever seen in his entire legal career. He saw a paranoid, risk-averse auditor who was terrified of her own shadow. He did not see a brilliant trap. He only saw an opportunity to lock me out forever. Are you seriously demanding that we take all the money and all the assets while you walk away with nothing but a shield against hypothetical malpractice claims? Richard asked, a cruel smile spreading across his face. Yes, I said firmly. Write the clause, Richard. Make it ironclad. Assume all the liability. Take the assets as they are, and I will sign my name on the dotted line right now. Richard looked at Beatrice and nodded eagerly, giving her the green light. They both thought I was making a monumental foolish mistake. They were incredibly eager to let me make it. Richard did not waste a single second. He immediately pulled a fresh legal pad from his briefcase and clicked his expensive silver pen. He was practically vibrating with excitement at the thought of outsmarting opposing counsel so thoroughly. He looked over at Beatrice, who gave him a sharp, approving nod. They both believed I was handing them the keys to the kingdom simply because I was too cowardly to face the ghost of my husband's aggressive career. David, however, was completely unglued. He grabbed my elbow, pulling me roughly toward the corner of the polished conference room. He positioned his body to block their view of my face. He kept his voice lowered to a harsh, furious whisper. "Claire, you cannot do this," he hissed, his face red with genuine distress. "I have been practicing law for 30 years, and this is the worst financial mistake I have ever seen a client make. You are giving away generational wealth because you are scared of a hypothetical lawsuit. Ryan had a highly profitable firm. Malpractice insurance covers those things. You do not need to burn down the entire house just because you are afraid of a few termites." I looked at David. My heart ached for him because he was a genuinely good man trying desperately to save a woman he thought was drowning in her own grief and paranoia. But I could not tell him the truth. I could not tell him that Ryan did not just have termites. Ryan had a massive structural collapse waiting to happen. The firm was drowning in a $4.5 million debt to my private equity company. The beautiful suburban house Jamal was so desperate to flip was sitting directly on top of a federal environmental disaster that carried a mandatory $2 million cleanup lien. If David knew the truth, he would be ethically obligated to disclose it during the mediation. The entire trap relied on Beatrice and Jamal voluntarily demanding the assets without looking under the hood. I had to let David believe I was making a fatal error in judgment. I pulled my elbow out of his grasp. "My decision is final, David," I said, raising my voice just enough for Richard to hear. "I am not built for this kind of stress. I just want out of this nightmare. I want to take Lily and start over completely clean. If they want Ryan's mess, they can have every single piece of it." David stared at me, his shoulders slumping in total defeat. He looked like a man watching a devastating car crash in slow motion. He shook his head and slowly walked back to his chair, sitting down heavily. Richard was already drafting the addendum, his pen flying across the lined paper. He wanted to make absolutely sure I could never come back and claim a single dime of the future profits. He began reading the clause aloud, his voice dripping with absolute smugness. "Let the record reflect that the receiving parties Beatrice and Jamal hereby assume any and all liabilities, debts, liens, encumbrances, and future legal actions, whether known or unknown, currently existing or arising in the future, associated with the estate of the deceased. The transferee. Claire assumes zero financial or legal responsibility for the business operations or real property. The estate is transferred entirely as is." Richard looked up from his legal pad, a nasty smile playing on his lips. "How does that sound, Claire?" he asked mockingly. "Are you sufficiently protected from the scary clients now?" "It sounds perfect," I replied, keeping my voice meek and submissive. "But I need you to type it out. I want it officially attached to the forced transfer agreement as an ironclad binding addendum before anyone signs anything today." Jamal let out a loud, arrogant groan, throwing his head back against his heavy leather chair. "You are unbelievable, Claire," he muttered, adjusting his flashy gold watch. Real estate and corporate law are about managing risk. There is no such thing as a perfect asset. Every property has a leaky pipe or a bad roof. You handle the problem and you take the profit. But of course, a timid little paper pusher like you would rather run away than handle a little bit of heat. Do you know how many houses I have flipped that had minor zoning issues? Real developers fix the problems. You just hand over the keys and run. I kept my head down, acting thoroughly chastised. Jamal had no idea that the minor issue he was talking about was a toxic chemical spill that would result in severe federal prosecution if he tried to ignore it. He was so blinded by his own greed and his burning desire to prove his superiority that he was eagerly begging to drink the poison. Richard pressed a button on his desk phone, instructing his paralegal to type up the handwritten clause immediately. We sat in silence for 10 agonizing minutes, waiting for the printer down the hall to finish. Beatrice spent the time examining her manicured nails completely unbothered. She was already mentally spending the massive retainer fees she believed were sitting untouched in the firm bank accounts. The paralegal finally walked in holding the crisp, freshly printed pages. She handed them to Richard, who quickly reviewed the dense legal language. He slid the stapled packet across the mahogany table, tapping his silver pen against the blank signature line. The trap was officially set. The heavy steel doors were waiting to slam shut. All they had to do was pick up the pen. Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished mahogany table. He looked at the printed addendum with profound admiration, like he had just painted a masterpiece. He turned his attention to Beatrice, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper that was still loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. "This is brilliant, Beatrice," he said, pointing the tip of his silver pen at the dense legal paragraphs. "She just handed you a complete fortress. By demanding this specific clause, she legally locked herself out of ever claiming a single dime of the estate profits. If the firm doubles its revenue next year, she cannot touch it. If Jamal flips the house for a massive premium, she gets absolutely nothing. She is entirely severed from the wealth." Beatrice smiled a slow, predatory smile. She looked at me from across the table, her eyes filled with absolute contempt. "You always were short-sighted, Claire," Beatrice mocked, adjusting her designer jacket. "You spend your entire life terrified of shadows, and you miss the gold mine sitting right in front of your face. But I suppose I should thank you. You are making this transition incredibly smooth. Ryan would be so disappointed in your lack of ambition, but I am utterly thrilled." Jamal could not contain his excitement any longer. He practically vibrated in his expensive leather chair. He leaned across the table and grabbed the silver pen right out of Richard's hand. "Stop talking and let us sign the paperwork," Jamal demanded, his voice loud and booming. "I have a demolition crew standing by at the property, and I am losing money every single hour we sit here debating with a paranoid accountant. Hand me the document, Richard. Let us make this official." Richard chuckled at Jamal's impatience, but slid the thick packet toward him. Jamal did not even bother reading the final printed text. He flipped straight to the back page, his eyes focused entirely on the blank signature lines. He pressed the pen to the paper and signed his name with a series of quick, aggressive strokes. He pushed the packet toward Beatrice. She took the pen from him, smoothing out the paper with her manicured hand. She took her time, signing her name with elegant, sweeping loops, wanting to savor every single second of her perceived victory. Megan sat next to her, clapping her hands together softly, celebrating the moment, like they had just won the lottery. Beatrice slid the signed document across the wide table. It came to a stop directly in front of me. The blank line for my signature seemed to glow against the crisp white paper. David let out a heavy sigh next to me. He placed his hand on top of the packet, trying to physically block me from picking up the pen. "Claire." "Please, David," whispered his voice thick with genuine emotion. "This is permanent. Once you sign this, you cannot take it back. Do not let them bully you out of your future." I looked at David, feeling a brief pang of guilt for deceiving him. But I knew this was the only way to protect Lily and myself from their toxic greed. I gently moved his hand off the document. "It is already done, David," I said softly. "I just want peace." I reached out and picked up the silver pen. I forced my hand to shake violently. I let the metal tip tap against the paper, creating a nervous staccato rhythm. I took a deep, ragged breath, acting as though I was forcing myself to overcome a massive wave of fear. Beatrice, Jamal, and Megan watched me with breathless anticipation. They were terrified I was going to change my mind at the last possible second. Jamal clenched his jaw, leaning forward in his chair, ready to yell at me if I put the pen down. I did not put the pen down. I pressed it against the paper and signed my full legal name. The exact second the dark ink dried on the white page, the entire atmosphere in the room shifted. My hand completely stopped trembling. My posture straightened. The act of the terrified, grieving widow vanished instantly, replaced by the cold, calculated composure of a forensic accountant who had just successfully executed a flawless corporate trap. I placed the silver pen down gently on the table. The sharp click of the metal hitting the mahogany echoed like a final judge gavel. I looked across the table at Beatrice, Jamal, and Megan. They were all grinning wildly, completely oblivious to the massive shift in my demeanor. They were too busy staring at the signed document, acting like they had just conquered the entire world. They thought they had finally defeated me once and for all. They had absolutely no idea they had just signed their own financial death warrants. I slowly pushed my chair back from the table and stood up, smoothing my skirt. The wait was finally over. I walked out of Richard's glass-paneled office without looking back. David followed closely behind me, his footsteps heavy and aggressive against the carpeted hallway. We stepped into the elevator in complete silence. The descent to the ground floor felt like it took hours. David stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter. He was radiating pure frustration. The elevator doors slid open, and we walked out into the massive underground parking garage. The air was thick with the smell of exhaust and damp concrete. I reached my modest sedan and pulled my keys from my purse. Before I could unlock the door, David slammed his hand against the roof of my car. The loud, hollow thud echoed through the empty concrete garage. "What is wrong with you, Claire?" he shouted, his voice cracking with genuine anger. "I have spent my entire career fighting for people who deserve justice, and you just rolled over and let those vultures pick your bones clean. You let them steal your home. You let them steal your husband's legacy. You handed a multi-million-dollar law practice to a woman who fired the receptionist just for looking at her the wrong way. And you did it all because Beatrice made a baseless, empty threat about family court. You are a brilliant accountant. You know numbers better than anyone I have ever met. How could you let them intimidate you into signing away everything you own?" He ran a hand over his face, looking exhausted and deeply defeated. "I cannot represent you anymore, Claire," he said softly, shaking his head. "I cannot watch you destroy your own life and your daughter's future just because you are too scared to fight." I stood there holding my car keys, listening to the echo of his angry voice fade into the concrete walls. I let him finish. I let him get all the righteous indignation out of his system. Then I slowly put my keys back into my purse. I did not cry. My shoulders did not slump. The fearful, trembling widow who had been crying in the conference room 10 minutes ago completely vanished. I straightened my posture, pulling my shoulders back. I looked David directly in the eyes, and my expression was as cold and hard as the concrete floor beneath our feet. I let out a slow, steady breath. "You are right about one thing, David," I said, my voice completely stripped of any emotion. "I know numbers better than anyone you have ever met." I took a step closer to him, dropping the facade entirely. I looked at him with the calculated gaze of a predator who had just successfully locked the cage. "David," I whispered the words slicing through the heavy air of the garage. "Ryan did not leave an empire. He left a crater. And I just handed them the detonator." David froze. His hand slowly dropped from the roof of my car. He stared at me, his anger evaporating instantly, replaced by profound confusion. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I leaned against the side of my car, keeping my voice low and even. Ryan was a terrible businessman, David, I explained smoothly. He was drowning in debt. He had a severe gambling problem and took out massive predatory loans using the law firm as collateral. The firm currently owes $4.5 million to a private equity group. On top of that, the beautiful suburban house Jamal is currently trying to flip sits directly on top of an illegal chemical dump site. The Environmental Protection Agency just issued a mandatory cleanup order with a $2 million federal lien attached to the property. David stopped breathing for a second. His legal mind was racing rapidly, processing the information. If I had fought them for the estate, I continued, Richard would have demanded a forensic audit. He would have opened the books and seen the massive debts. They would have run away screaming. I needed them to demand the assets without looking under the hood. I needed them blinded by their own arrogance. By demanding the A's transfer and the assumption of liability clause, I did not just give them the assets. I legally forced Beatrice and Jamal to personally guarantee millions of dollars in toxic debt and federal fines. I pierced their corporate veils. By signing that paper, they took the debt out of Ryan's name and attached it directly to their own personal bank accounts. Richard thought he was so smart writing that clause out for me, I added. He was so eager to lock me out of the profits that he completely ignored the fundamental rule of due diligence. He let his clients buy a sinking ship without checking for holes. David started to laugh. It was a breathless, shocked sound of pure disbelief. Jamal signed it, David said, covering his mouth. Jamal signed a personal guarantee on a toxic waste site, and Beatrice signed for a bankrupt firm. David stepped back, his eyes wide with absolute shock. He looked at me like he was seeing me for the very first time. You did not surrender. He breathed out a mixture of awe and terror in his voice. You set a trap, a perfect, inescapable legal trap. I opened my car door and offered him a small, chilling smile. Yes, David, I did. And the timer is already ticking. 2 weeks later, the timer I had set was rapidly counting down to 0, but Jamal and Megan were oblivious. They were too busy celebrating their stolen victory. They threw a massive housewarming party at the suburban estate to show off their new prize. They hired a premium catering company, a string quartet, and a valet service to park the luxury cars along the winding driveway. The entire first floor of my former home was packed with Jamal's real estate buddies and Megan's high society friends. Waiters walked through the crowd carrying silver trays loaded with crystal flutes of expensive imported champagne. Jamal stood near the fireplace wearing a custom velvet blazer, holding court with local developers. He bragged about acquiring the property for absolutely nothing. He told them he masterfully negotiated a desperate grieving widow out of her $1 million asset using pure business acumen. He laughed, describing my supposed cowardice, painting me as a weak accountant who ran away at the first sign of legal pressure. Megan was across the room, giving a tour of the kitchen, pointing out the load-bearing walls she planned to tear down. They were drunk on pure arrogance, living entirely in a fantasy built on stolen wealth. The string quartet was playing a lively classical piece when the heavy oak front door suddenly swung open. The valet attendant tried to step in the way, but a burly man pushed past him into the elegant foyer. It was Tom, the lead contractor. He was not wearing a tuxedo. He wore his faded work shirt, heavy denim jeans, and scuffed steel-toed boots. He looked completely out of place among the designer dresses. More importantly, Tom looked incredibly stressed, holding a thick manila folder tightly against his chest. Jamal spotted him immediately. His arrogant smile faltered for a fraction of a second before he excused himself from the developers. He marched over to the foyer, his face flushed with anger. He grabbed Tom by the arm and roughly pulled him into the hallway, away from the main crowd. Jamal hissed at him, demanding to know what he was doing, crashing a private, high-end event, dressed like a common laborer. Tom pulled his arm out of Jamal's grip. He did not look intimidated anymore. He looked like a man trying to save himself from a sinking ship. Tom opened the manila folder and pulled out a stack of documents stamped with bold red warning labels. He shoved the papers directly into Jamal's chest, forcing him to take them. I told you, I could not just pour concrete over that sludge, Tom said, his voice tight. I brought in an independent environmental engineer to test the soil samples from the basement foundation. The results came back this morning. That is not just a leaky pipe or standard runoff. The soil beneath this entire property is a confirmed illegal chemical dumping ground from the 1980s. It is saturated with high levels of toxic industrial solvents and heavy metals. Jamal stared at the papers but refused to read the words. He shook his head angrily, telling Tom he was overreacting and that they could just seal the basement. You cannot ignore it, Tom fired back, raising his voice. The toxicity levels are so high they legally triggered a federal alert. My engineer was required by law to notify the Environmental Protection Agency immediately. The EPA is already involved, Jamal. They are issuing a formal mandate. This entire property is a certified biohazard zone. Jamal completely lost his temper. His absolute denial took over. He grabbed the formal lab report from Tom and viciously tore it in half. He threw the ripped pieces onto the hardwood floor, pointing a shaking finger directly at Tom's face. You are fired. Jamal spat his eyes wide with irrational fury. Get out of my house right now before I have the police drag you out. I am going to sue you for breach of contract and ruin your entire career for stepping out of line. This is $1 million property, and I am not letting a cowardly contractor slow down my renovation. Get out. Tom looked at the torn papers on the floor and then looked at Jamal with profound pity. I am not the one who is going to be ruined, Tom said quietly. Good luck. Tom turned around and walked out the front door. Jamal took a deep breath, smoothed his velvet blazer, and plastered his arrogant smile back onto his face. He walked back into the living room, grabbed a fresh glass of champagne, and rejoined his friends. He raised his glass for a toast, convinced he was the smartest man in the room. He refused to believe the ground beneath his feet was already toxic. The morning after the lavish housewarming party, the sprawling suburban estate was completely silent. The catering crew had cleared away the empty champagne flutes, and the valet service was long gone. Jamal woke up late, his head throbbing slightly from the expensive liquor, but his ego was massive. He stood by the massive front window of the master bedroom, wearing a silk robe looking out over the manicured front lawn. He was already calculating how much he could charge for the property once the kitchen walls were knocked down. As he admired his stolen kingdom, a plain white government vehicle slowly pulled up to the edge of the driveway. It was not a construction truck or a luxury car. It had an official federal seal printed on the side door. A stern-looking man in a high-visibility jacket stepped out of the vehicle carrying a clipboard and a roll of heavy-duty industrial tape. He did not walk up to the front door to knock. Instead, he marched directly to the ornate iron gates that guarded the entrance to the property. Jamal frowned, his cup of coffee pausing halfway to his mouth. He watched as the man pulled a massive, bright red placard from his clipboard. It was impossible to miss. The man slapped the red warning sign directly onto the center of the iron gate and began taping it down securely. Jamal slammed his coffee mug onto the windowsill, spilling hot liquid over the wood. He stormed out of the bedroom, marching down the grand staircase and out the front door. He marched down the long driveway, his silk robe flapping in the morning breeze. Hey, Jamal shouted, his voice echoing down the quiet street. What do you think you are doing, putting trash on my gate? Take that down right now. The inspector finished taping the bottom corner of the red placard and turned to face Jamal. He did not look intimidated by Jamal's aggressive tone. He looked at Jamal with the tired expression of a federal employee who dealt with angry property owners every single day. Are you the current owner of this property? The inspector asked, his voice flat and authoritative. I absolutely am, Jamal fired back, crossing his arms over his chest. And I am telling you to remove that sticker before I call the police and report you for vandalism. The inspector tapped the red placard with his pen. This is not vandalism, sir. This is an official mandate from the Environmental Protection Agency. We received an emergency report from an independent structural engineer yesterday afternoon. This entire residential lot is sitting on top of an unsealed chemical dumping ground. The soil toxicity levels are off the charts. As of this morning, this property is officially condemned for human habitation until a full federal cleanup is completed. Jamal scoffed, stepping closer to the gate to read the bright red sign. The bold black letters spelled out the words, hazardous materials and mandatory federal remediation. Beneath the warnings was an estimated cost of compliance. Jamal stared at the number printed at the bottom of the page. $2 million. $2 million. Jamal read aloud, his voice cracking slightly. Are you out of your mind? There is no way a little bit of bad dirt costs $2 million to clean up. It is not a little bit of bad dirt, the inspector corrected him sharply. It is thousands of gallons of industrial solvent that has seeped into the bedrock. The government will have to excavate the entire foundation, rip up the lawn, and safely dispose of the contaminated soil. By law, the owner of the property is entirely responsible for the cost of the remediation. You have 30 days to secure the funding, or the federal government will place a massive lien on all of your assets. Have a good day, sir. The inspector got back into his white vehicle and drove away, leaving Jamal standing on the driveway staring at the red sign. The front door of the house opened, and Megan walked out, wrapping a cardigan tightly around her shoulders. She hurried down the driveway looking panicked. Jamal. What is going on? Megan asked, her eyes darting from his pale face to the terrifying red placard on the gate. Who was that man? What does that sign mean? For a brief second, Jamal actually felt the icy grip of panic tighten around his throat. $2 million was more cash than he had ever seen in his entire life. It was enough to bankrupt him instantly. But then his boundless arrogance rushed back in, pushing the fear away. He let out a loud booming laugh that startled Megan. He reached out and patted the cold iron gate. Relax, Megan. Jamal said, a massive, arrogant grin spreading across his face. It is a federal cleanup order. The EPA wants $2 million to fix the soil. Megan gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. $2 million, she shrieked. Jamal, we do not have that kind of money. We cannot pay for that. We will lose everything. Jamal waved his hand dismissively, pulling her into a confident hug. We are not paying a single dime, Megan. Think about it. The deed to this house is still technically tied to Ryan's estate. We just initiated the transfer. All the historical records and the original purchase documents have Ryan's name all over them. The EPA is going after the registered owner of the property. Jamal pointed at the red warning sign with absolute supreme confidence. Let the government issue their little fines, he laughed heartily. Let them demand their $2 million. The house is in your dead brother's name. The government is going to waste their time trying to sue a ghost. Megan let out a huge sigh of relief, a wicked smile returning to her face. Oh, Jamal, you are brilliant, she praised him. For a second, I thought that stupid accountant actually stuck us with a toxic house. Jamal chuckled proudly, entirely convinced of his own genius. He had completely forgotten the ironclad assumption of liability document he had so eagerly signed in the lawyer's office. He was so blinded by the illusion of his own untouchable wealth that he willingly walked back into a condemned house believing he was perfectly safe. While Jamal and Megan were laughing off a federal environmental disaster, Beatrice was enjoying her own delusional fantasy across town. She sat behind the massive custom mahogany desk in Ryan's corner office. The morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the expensive modern art on the walls. Beatrice was not reviewing legal briefs or managing the firm. She was staring at the large computer monitor, actively shopping for a brand-new luxury vehicle. She clicked through the customized options for a sleek silver Bentley. She selected the premium leather interior and the upgraded sound system, watching the price tag climb well over $200,000. She felt absolutely entitled to it. She believed she had successfully secured her son's multi-million-dollar empire by simply bullying a weak accountant out of the picture. She reached for her freshly brewed cup of imported coffee, taking a slow, satisfied sip. She was already planning which country club she would join to show off her newfound wealth. Her pleasant daydream was abruptly interrupted by a frantic knock on the heavy wooden door. Before Beatrice could even grant permission, the door pushed open. Gregory, the senior accountant, stood in the doorway. He looked entirely disheveled. His tie was loosened, his face was pale, and he was breathing heavily, as if he had just sprinted up the stairs instead of taking the elevator. Beatrice narrowed her eyes, setting her coffee cup down with a sharp clink. "I thought I made it explicitly clear, Gregory, that I am not to be disturbed unless it is a matter of depositing incoming retainer fees." She snapped, her tone dripping with aristocratic annoyance. Gregory did not apologize. He did not cower like he had during their first meeting. He walked directly to the desk, holding a thick, certified envelope that had just been delivered by an urgent courier. He placed it directly over the keyboard, blocking her view of the silver Bentley. "You need to read this right now," Mrs. Beatrice Gregory said, his voice shaking with absolute terror. "I tried to tell you about the pending liabilities last week, but you refused to listen. You demanded the master bank accounts and ignored the debt. Well, the debt just came calling, and it is completely catastrophic." Beatrice let out a loud, irritated sigh. She snatched the heavy envelope from the desk, tearing the perforated edge with her manicured fingernail. "You are entirely too dramatic, Gregory," she scolded, pulling out the thick stack of premium paper. "Ryan ran a highly successful law practice. A few outstanding vendor invoices are not a crisis." She unfolded the document and smoothed it out on the desk. The bold black logo at the top of the page read, "Apex Holding Private Equity." Beatrice frowned, scanning the first paragraph. The legal jargon was dense, but the bold numbers printed in the center of the page were impossible to misunderstand. It was a formal notice of default and demand for immediate payment. The principal balance due was $4.5 million. Beatrice let out a sharp scoff of disbelief. $4.5 million, she read aloud, her voice echoing in the large office. "This is obviously some kind of fraudulent scam, a phishing attempt. Ryan did not owe anyone this kind of money. He was a brilliant attorney bringing in millions a year." Gregory slammed both of his hands onto the desk, leaning forward. "It is not a scam, Mrs. Beatrice," he pleaded desperately. "Ryan had a severe gambling addiction. He successfully hid it from everyone in this family. When he exhausted his personal funds, he started using the firm as collateral to take out predatory loans. He borrowed heavily from this private equity group just to keep the lights on and pay the staff. The master bank accounts you were so eager to access are practically empty. Every single dollar of retained earnings went toward paying the staggering interest on this specific loan." Beatrice felt a cold knot form in her stomach, but her massive ego refused to let her fully process the danger. She glared at Gregory, unwilling to accept that her golden child was a flawed gambling addict who had left her a hollow shell of a business. "You are lying," she hissed, her face turning red. "My son was perfect. He would never jeopardize his legacy like this. This Apex Holding Company is just trying to extort a grieving family. I will not let some nameless, faceless private equity firm steal my money." Beatrice looked back down at the demand letter. Attached to the back was a copy of the original promissory note. She recognized Ryan's signature instantly. It was the same bold, sweeping handwriting he had used on every birthday card he ever gave her. The reality of the signature made the cold knot in her stomach tighten significantly. The document explicitly stated that the loan was secured by the entirety of the corporate assets. But even faced with the undeniable physical proof, Beatrice refused to panic. Her mind instantly went to me. She remembered how eager I was to sign the assumption of liability clause. Beatrice smiled a wicked, twisted smile. She assumed I had discovered this debt and simply ran away like a coward. Beatrice thought she was still the smartest person in the room. Gregory shook his head, stepping back from the desk. "They are not trying to steal your money, Mrs. Beatrice," he said quietly. "They already own the firm. If we do not wire $4.5 million to their account by the end of the business week, they are legally entitled to liquidate every single asset in this building. They will take the computers, the desks, the client lists, and the accounts receivable." Beatrice grabbed her cell phone from the desk, her hands finally starting to tremble. She scrolled aggressively through her contacts until she found Richard's name. Get out of my office, Gregory, she yelled, pointing toward the door. I am calling my lawyer. Richard will squash this fraudulent garbage by lunchtime. Gregory turned and walked out, knowing there was absolutely nothing left to save. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind Gregory, leaving Beatrice entirely alone in the massive executive office. She pressed the phone hard against her ear, listening to the agonizingly slow ringing on the other end of the line. Her manicured nails tapped frantically against the polished mahogany desk. When Richard finally answered, his voice was smooth and unbothered, expecting a routine update on the estate transfer. Beatrice shattered his calm demeanor instantly. She demanded he drop whatever he was doing and get to her office immediately. She read him the astronomical $4.5 million figure over the phone and told him a private equity firm was threatening to seize the entire business. Richard arrived less than 15 minutes later. His office was only 3 blocks away, but he looked slightly winded when he strode through the double-glass doors of the firm. He bypassed the empty reception desk and walked straight into the corner office. Beatrice was pacing back and forth in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows, her designer heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She practically shoved the thick certified envelope into his chest the moment he walked through the door. Richard adjusted his expensive silk tie and pulled out the legal documents. He read through the formal notice of default, his eyes scanning the dense paragraphs and the attached promissory note. For a brief, terrifying second, Beatrice saw a flash of genuine alarm cross his face. The sum was staggering. But as Richard continued to read, his posture began to relax. The tension melted away from his shoulders. By the time he reached the final page, he was no longer frowning. He actually let out a low, breathy chuckle. Beatrice stopped pacing. She stared at him as if he had completely lost his mind. "What on earth are you laughing at, Richard?" she demanded, her voice shrill with anxiety. "Did you not see the numbers? They want $4.5 million by the end of the week. Gregory told me the master bank accounts are completely empty. The firm is bankrupt. My son left me a mountain of toxic debt." Richard tossed the stack of papers casually onto the desk. He walked over to one of the plush leather guest chairs and sat down, crossing his legs. He looked at Beatrice with the deeply patronizing smile of a teacher explaining a simple concept to a slow student. "You are panicking over absolutely nothing," Beatrice, Richard said smoothly. "You need to remember how corporate law actually works. Yes, Ryan took out a massive loan. Yes, he used the business as collateral. And yes, the firm is apparently out of cash. But look at the top of that letter. The debt belongs to the law firm. It is an LLC, a limited liability company." Beatrice crossed her arms, still unconvinced. "What difference does that make?" she snapped. "I own the company now, which means I own the debt." Richard shook his head, leaning forward. "That is the beauty of the corporate veil, Beatrice," he explained. "The firm is a completely separate legal entity from you. Apex Holding can sue the firm all they want. They can win a judgment for $50 million if they please. But if the firm has zero liquid assets, they get absolutely nothing. They can come in here and repossess these nice leather chairs and the computer monitors, but they cannot touch a single penny of your personal wealth. Your private bank accounts, your investments, and the suburban house Jamal is flipping are completely legally insulated." Beatrice let out a long, shaky breath. The color slowly returned to her pale face. "Are you absolutely certain, Richard?" she asked. "They cannot come after me personally. I am a senior partner at a corporate law firm," Beatrice. Richard boasted, his ego inflating to fill the room. "I deal with distressed assets all the time. This private equity group is just trying to use aggressive scare tactics to see if you are foolish enough to pay them out of your own pocket. If you ignore them, the absolute worst thing that happens is this specific business entity declares bankruptcy and dissolves. You walk away without a scratch." Richard was completely blinded by his own arrogance. In his eagerness to prove his legal superiority, he entirely forgot the mediation session 2 weeks prior. He forgot the highly specific assumption of liability clause he had personally drafted and enthusiastically pushed Beatrice to sign. He forgot that the clause explicitly pierced the corporate veil, stripping away the LLC protections and making Beatrice the personal guarantor of all existing debts. He believed he was shielding his client, when in reality he had already tied her directly to the sinking ship. Beatrice smiled, her confidence fully restored. She walked over to the desk and picked up the Apex Holding demand letter. With a dramatic flourish, she ripped the heavy paper right down the middle and tossed the pieces into the trash can. She walked over to the private wet bar in the corner of the office and pulled out a bottle of expensive vintage champagne Ryan kept for winning big cases. She popped the cork, the loud snap echoing in the room. She poured 2 crystal flutes and handed one to Richard. They clinked their glasses together, toasting to their brilliant invincibility, completely unaware that the countdown had not stopped. 3 days after Beatrice and Richard toasted their imagined victory with my husband's vintage champagne, we all met at the downtown probate courthouse. It was a cold Tuesday morning, but the chill in the air was nothing compared to the absolute ice running through my veins. This was the final hearing. The final stamp of approval from the state of New York that would legally bind Beatrice and Jamal to the financial ruin they had so aggressively demanded. I walked through the heavy wooden double doors of the courtroom with my attorney David right by my side. Unlike our tense elevator ride 2 weeks ago, David was no longer lecturing me. In fact, he was practically vibrating with a suppressed nervous energy. Ever since I revealed the truth about the toxic debt and the federal environmental lien in the parking garage, David had been reviewing the legal trap from every possible angle. He realized it was a flawless corporate maneuver. Now he just had to play the part of the defeated family lawyer one last time. We took our seats at the petitioner's table. A few moments later, the heavy doors swung open again and the royal procession arrived. Beatrice, Jamal, and Megan walked down the center aisle of the courtroom, looking like they were attending a coronation rather than a probate hearing. They were dressed to the absolute nines. Beatrice wore a stunning white tailored suit adorned with a massive diamond brooch. Megan was carrying one of the very designer handbags she had demanded I leave behind at the house. Jamal was wearing a sharp navy blue pinstripe suit, his heavy gold watch flashing under the fluorescent courtroom lights. They took their seats at the respondents' table right next to Richard, who was busy organizing his legal files with a look of supreme self-satisfaction. Jamal leaned back in his wooden chair, casually throwing one arm over the backrest. He shot me a wide, mocking grin. Megan whispered something into Beatrice's ear, and both women let out a soft, condescending laugh. They thought they had arrived to witness my ultimate humiliation. They thought they were here to collect the keys to their empire. The bailiff announced the arrival of the judge, and we all stood. Judge Harrison, a stern-looking man in his late 60s with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, took his seat at the high wooden bench. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at the massive stack of paperwork Richard had submitted to the court. The room fell completely silent. The only sound was the rustling of heavy paper as Judge Harrison reviewed the forced transfer agreement and the highly specific assumption of liability addendum. Judge Harrison frowned. His brow furrowed deeply as he read the clauses. He looked up from the paperwork and focused his sharp gaze directly on me. He saw a young widow dressed in a simple black dress, holding a modest purse sitting next to a seemingly defeated lawyer. Mrs. Clare, the judge, began, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet courtroom. I have reviewed these documents thoroughly. It is the duty of this court to ensure that estate transfers are executed fairly and that no party is being subjected to undue coercion. I am looking at an agreement where you are voluntarily relinquishing all claims to a multi-million-dollar residential property and a highly lucrative legal practice. He paused, tapping his pen against the wooden bench. Furthermore, the judge continued, you have demanded a clause that places all future liabilities and debts entirely onto the shoulders of your mother-in-law and your brother-in-law. You are walking away from this marriage with absolutely nothing but a liability shield. Are you completely certain you are of sound mind and that you are not being forced into this decision? Richard stood up immediately, buttoning his expensive suit jacket. Your Honor, My clients are simply fulfilling the dying wishes of the deceased, Richard argued smoothly. The widow has requested this specific liability protection to ease her own anxieties regarding the legal profession. We are simply accommodating her requests to finalize this estate peacefully. Judge Harrison raised his hand, silencing Richard instantly. I did not ask you, counselor, the judge said firmly. I am asking the widow. The judge looked back at me. His expression was full of genuine concern. He thought he was watching a tragic injustice unfold right in front of his eyes. He thought he was watching a grieving mother give away her child's inheritance. Mrs. Clare, I am going to ask you one last time, Judge Harrison said, his voice softening slightly. Once I stamp this document, it becomes a binding legal order. You will have no recourse to reclaim these assets in the future. Do you understand that you are walking away with absolutely nothing? I slowly stood up from my chair. I did not look at Beatrice or Jamal or Megan. I kept my eyes locked directly on the judge. I maintained my perfectly calm and measured composure. I did not tremble, and I did not cry. I understand perfectly. Your Honor, I said, my voice clear and unwavering. I know exactly what I'm leaving behind. Please stamp the document. Judge Harrison held my gaze for a long, heavy moment. He searched my face, looking for any sign of hesitation, any flicker of doubt. He found absolutely nothing. I was a fortress of calm. Satisfied that I was not acting under duress, he finally lowered his eyes back to the massive stack of legal paperwork sitting on his elevated wooden bench. He picked up his heavy brass seal and pressed it firmly against the signature page of the forced transfer agreement. The loud metallic crunch of the seal biting into the heavy paper echoed through the silent courtroom. Then he picked up his wooden gavel and struck the sound block with a sharp, definitive crack. The estate of Ryan is hereby transferred in its entirety to the respondents Beatrice and Jamal. Judge Harrison declared, his voice projecting authority across the room. All provisions, clauses, and addendums attached to this agreement, including the assumption of liability, are now legally binding and permanently recognized by the state of New York. This matter is officially closed. Court is adjourned. Judge Harrison stood up and disappeared through the heavy oak door behind his bench. The second the door clicked shut, the tension in the courtroom completely snapped. A collective exhale rushed from the respondents' table. Richard leaned back in his chair, unbuttoning his suit jacket with a look of supreme, arrogant satisfaction. He turned to Beatrice and extended his hand, offering his formal congratulations. Beatrice shook his hand warmly, a brilliant, victorious smile spreading across her face. Jamal actually high-fived Megan, his heavy gold watch catching the fluorescent light. They were practically buzzing with adrenaline. They had done it. They had successfully bullied me out of my inheritance and claimed a multi-million-dollar empire without shedding a single drop of sweat. David sat quietly next to me. He did not pack up his briefcase. He did not move. He simply folded his hands on the table and watched the spectacle unfolding across the aisle. He knew the bomb was armed. He was just waiting for me to press the button. Beatrice stood up and smoothed the wrinkles from her pristine white tailored suit. She grabbed her handbag and turned to me with absolute, unadulterated contempt. She felt like a queen looking at an exiled peasant. You can leave now, Claire, Beatrice said, her voice dripping with cold condescension. There is no need for you to sit there sulking. We have a very expensive celebration dinner to attend at Belmont's, and I would hate for your depressing presence to ruin our evening. You should probably go figure out where you and your daughter are going to sleep tonight. Jamal stood up next to her, sliding his phone into his pocket. He let out a loud, booming laugh. Yeah, Claire, he chimed in, pointing a mocking finger at me. You better get a head start. The bus schedule can be pretty unforgiving in this part of the city. But hey, if you ever need a small loan to cover rent, you know who to call. Just do not expect any family discounts. Megan giggled, linking her arm through Jamal's. She looked at my simple black dress and shook her head in faux pity. You really played this terribly, Claire, she sneered. You could have walked away with a little bit of dignity. Instead, you walk away with absolutely nothing. Let this be a lesson to you. Never try to play a high-stakes game against people who actually know how the world works. They waited for me to react. They desperately wanted me to break down in tears, to scream at them, or to run out of the courtroom hiding my face in shame. They wanted the final satisfying victory of watching me shatter into a million pieces. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not even blink. I remained perfectly seated in my hard wooden chair. I slowly turned my head and looked at Beatrice, Jamal, and Megan. I let a small, chilling smile touch the corners of my mouth. It was not the smile of a defeated widow. It was the smile of the forensic accountant who had just successfully executed the most flawless corporate trap in the history of New York probate court. I slowly reached down to the floor next to my chair. I picked up my sleek black leather briefcase and placed it squarely on the petitioner's table. The sharp metallic click of the brass latches snapping wide open sounded like a loud gunshot in the quiet room. I did not rush. I deliberately lifted the leather flap, reaching my hand inside. I bypassed my laptop and my standard legal pads. Instead, my fingers closed tightly around a thick, heavy folder stamped with bold red ink. I pulled the thick, heavy folder from the briefcase and let the leather flap fall shut. The bold red ink stamped across the top of the manila cover caught the harsh fluorescent light of the courtroom. I stood up, holding the folder in my right hand. The sudden movement caught the attention of everyone at the respondents' table. Jamal stopped laughing mid-sentence. Megan lowered her expensive designer handbag, resting it on her lap. Beatrice narrowed her cold eyes, watching me with a mixture of profound annoyance and deep suspicion. She genuinely believed I was coming over to beg for a handout. I walked slowly around the petitioner's table, my heels clicking softly and rhythmically against the polished wood floor. I did not walk toward Beatrice. I did not even look at Jamal. I walked directly toward Richard. He was still sitting comfortably in his heavy wooden chair, his custom suit jacket unbuttoned, looking at me like I was a mild inconvenience that refused to simply go away. I stopped right in front of him. I did not say a single word. I simply extended my arm and dropped the red stamped folder directly onto his pristine yellow legal pad. The heavy thud of the thick paper hitting the table broke the tense silence in the room. Richard scoffed, rolling his eyes dramatically. He thought it was a desperate last-minute plea, or perhaps a meaningless list of grievances. He reached out with a perfectly manicured hand and flipped the heavy cover open. I stood there silently and watched the exact moment his entire professional career flashed before his eyes. He read the first paragraph. The arrogant, smug smirk vanished from his lips instantly. His eyes darted back to the top of the page, frantically rereading the bold print, as if hoping the words would miraculously change. The color began to drain rapidly from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. He flipped to the second page, his fingers suddenly fumbling clumsily with the heavy paper. By the time he reached the third page, his hands were violently shaking. The paper rattled noisily in his tightening grip. A thick bead of cold sweat formed on his forehead. He looked exactly like a man who had just been handed his own unavoidable death warrant. He completely stopped breathing. He simply sat there paralyzed, staring at the undeniable mathematical proof of his monumental legal malpractice. Beatrice noticed his sudden bizarre paralysis. She leaned over, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "Richard!" She snapped, her voice sharp and highly irritated. "What is that? What did she just give you? Stop shaking and give it to me right now." Richard did not hand her the folder. He could not physically let go of the paper. His knuckles were completely stark white. He slowly looked up at Beatrice, his eyes wide with absolute, unadulterated terror. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his throat. "Beatrice," Richard stammered, his voice cracking and incredibly weak. "Beatrice, the assumption of liability clause. The addendum I drafted for you this morning." "Yes, Richard. I know what the clause is," Beatrice said, rolling her eyes impatiently. "It legally locked her out of my profits forever. Now tell me what is in that ridiculous folder so we can leave this miserable building and go to dinner." Richard shook his head slowly from side to side. No, Beatrice. He whispered, his voice trembling so badly it was barely audible in the quiet room. It did not lock her out. It locked you in. This folder contains the certified financial ledgers for Ryan's law firm. He was bankrupt. He took out a massive $4.5 million predatory loan from a private equity group called Apex Holding. The loan is currently in severe default. I already know about that Apex Holding garbage. Beatrice scoffed, waving her manicured hand dismissively. We discussed this in my office days ago. The debt belongs to the LLC. They cannot touch me personally. You told me that yourself. Richard squeezed his eyes shut, a look of pure physical agony twisting his features. That was before the judge stamped the forced transfer agreement. Richard choked out, his voice rising in sheer blind panic. Beatrice, the clause you signed today, the one I absolutely insisted you sign. It explicitly pierced the corporate veil. It completely stripped away all of your limited liability protections. By accepting the estate as is, and assuming all legal and financial liabilities, you did not just inherit the firm. You personally guaranteed its debts. The words hung in the air, heavy and totally suffocating. Beatrice stared at him, her mind desperately struggling to process the catastrophic information. You just took $4.5 million of corporate toxic debt. Richard choked out, pointing a violently shaking finger at the official court document sitting on the table, and you legally attached it to your personal bank accounts, your investment portfolios, and your own private assets. They do not just own the empty firm anymore, Beatrice. They own you. Beatrice let out a harsh, breathless gasp. She looked from Richard to the red-stamped folder, and then finally over to me. Her mind simply refused to accept the reality of the situation. She shook her head violently, her heavy pearl necklace rattling against her collarbone. "You are lying," she hissed at Richard, her voice echoing sharply across the courtroom. "You are just a cowardly, incompetent lawyer trying to cover up your own massive mistakes. I am not paying a single dime to some faceless, predatory corporation. I will hire a real legal team. I will drag Apex Holding into federal court, and I will tie them up in endless litigation for the next decade. They will not see a single penny of my money." Jamal jumped up from his chair, his gold watch catching the light. "That is exactly right," Jamal shouted, pointing aggressively at Richard. "You do not just roll over for these private equity vultures. We have the resources and the connections to fight this. We will countersue them for predatory lending practices. We will bury them in paperwork until they drop the claim completely. Nobody walks into our lives and steals $4.5 million. I listened to their desperate, panicked shouting for a few seconds longer. They were clinging desperately to the illusion of their own untouchable power, completely unaware that the executioner was already standing right across the room. I slowly pushed my wooden chair back and stood up. The scraping sound of the wood against the floor immediately silenced their frantic arguing. Every single eye in the courtroom locked onto me. Even Judge Harrison, who had paused with his hand on the doorknob behind his bench, turned around to watch the final act of this incredible drama unfold. The room was dead silent. My voice was calm, measured, and completely devoid of any sympathy. It echoed clearly off the high wooden ceilings. "You are not going to fight anyone in federal court, Beatrice," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy air like a perfectly sharpened scalpel. "You are not going to tie them up in litigation, and you are certainly not going to countersue for predatory lending." Beatrice glared at me, her face twisted into an ugly mask of pure hatred and denial. "And why exactly is that?" "Claire," she spat, gripping the edge of the respondent's table so hard her knuckles turned white. "Do you think I am afraid of a bunch of corporate suits hiding behind a private equity name? I am a wealthy, powerful woman. I can crush them without breaking a sweat." I took a slow, deliberate step away from the petitioner's table. "You cannot crush them, Beatrice," I explained smoothly, "because you do not understand who you are actually dealing with. You spent the last decade looking down on me, calling me a glorified calculator. You assumed that because I did not wear flashy designer clothes or drive luxury European cars, I was completely useless. You thought Ryan was the undisputed financial genius of this family. I paused, letting the massive weight of my words settle over them. Ryan was a charismatic trial lawyer, I continued, but behind closed doors, he was a degenerate gambler and a catastrophic financial failure. 3 years ago, he completely drained the firm accounts. He was days away from total bankruptcy and public disbarment. He was desperate for a secret bailout, but no legitimate bank would lend him another dollar, so I gave him one. David, my lawyer, sat frozen next to me, watching the absolute devastation sweep across the opposing table. I set up a perfectly legal, fully insulated private equity firm. I said, my voice ringing with undeniable authority. I used my own private capital, the money I earned from my highly successful forensic accounting career, to issue my husband a massive corporate loan. I drafted the promissory note myself. I set the interest rates. And I required him to use the entirety of his law firm as the primary collateral. Richard gasped loudly, his eyes widening in sheer absolute horror as the final piece of the puzzle snapped into place. Jamal stopped breathing, his jaw dropping completely open. Megan let out a tiny, pathetic whimper, covering her mouth with both of her shaking hands. Beatrice stared at me, her entire body trembling uncontrollably. "What are you saying?" she whispered, her voice completely devoid of its previous arrogance. I looked her dead in the eye, delivering the final fatal blow. "I am saying that Apex Holding is not some faceless corporate entity, Beatrice. I am the sole founder, the primary shareholder, and the chief executive officer of Apex Holding. Ryan borrowed $4.5 million from my company." I pointed directly at the signed court documents sitting on the table. "When you bullied me into signing that forced transfer agreement, you did not just steal my husband's business. You willingly, legally, and permanently assumed his massive debt. You pierced your own corporate veil and attached that debt directly to your personal wealth." I took one final step forward, looking down at the broken, arrogant woman who had tried to destroy my life. "You owe me $4.5 million, Beatrice," I stated, my voice perfectly cold and unwavering. "And the payment is due today." Pandemonium completely erupted inside the courtroom. Beatrice let out a sound that was half scream and half gasp, clutching her chest as if she had just been physically struck. She slumped back into her wooden chair, completely paralyzed by the astronomical number I had just dropped on her head. Richard, the arrogant corporate shark who had spent the entire morning mocking me, did not even attempt to comfort his client. Instead, he frantically began shoving his files into his expensive leather briefcase. He knew a sinking ship when he saw one, and he was desperately trying to abandon it before he got pulled under. But Jamal was not ready to surrender. His massive ego simply would not allow him to accept that a quiet forensic accountant had outsmarted him. He jumped to his feet, knocking his heavy wooden chair backward onto the floor. "Shut up!" Jamal shouted, his voice booming over the chaos. "Everyone just shut up!" He pointed an aggressive finger at me, his face twisted into an ugly mask of pure desperation. "You think you are so smart, Claire?" he sneered, adjusting his custom suit jacket. "You think you trapped us with some corporate loophole? Well, you forgot one massive detail. The suburban estate. We still have the house." He turned to Beatrice and Megan, spreading his arms wide like a savior. "Do not panic," Jamal commanded them. "That house sits on a prime acre of real estate. I already have the demolition crew tearing down the walls. I can flip that property in 2 months and sell it to a Manhattan developer for $3 million in pure cash. We will use the profit to hire a real legal team, crush her stupid private equity company, and keep the rest of the money for ourselves. I am a licensed realtor. I know how to spin a profit out of thin air. You are looking at a master developer. We are not paying her a single dime." He was practically shouting at the ceiling, completely drunk on his own delusional confidence. But right in the middle of his grand, arrogant speech, his cell phone began to vibrate violently in his pocket. Jamal ignored it, wanting to finish his triumphant rant, but the phone immediately started buzzing again, ringing with a loud, obnoxious tone that echoed in the high-ceilinged courtroom. Annoyed, he pulled the phone from his pocket. He glanced at the caller ID, and his aggressive posture shifted slightly. It was the branch manager of his primary financial institution. The bank that held his personal savings, his business capital, and his credit lines. Jamal swiped the screen and pressed the phone to his ear. "What is it?" he barked impatiently. "I am in the middle of a major legal victory here." Because the courtroom had fallen completely silent, we could all hear the tiny frantic voice of the bank manager leaking through the phone speaker. The voice did not sound congratulatory. It sounded panicked. Mr. Jamal, the banker, said, his words rushing out in a terrified blur. "I am calling to inform you that our fraud department just received an emergency federal mandate. We have been legally ordered to freeze every single one of your accounts. Your personal checking, your business capital, and your joint savings with your wife are all completely locked." Jamal froze. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and completely hollow. "What are you talking about?" Jamal demanded, his voice suddenly shrinking. "You cannot freeze my money. I have hundreds of thousands of dollars in those accounts." "You currently have nothing, sir," the banker replied grimly. "The Environmental Protection Agency just placed a massive federal lien on your Social Security number and your professional real estate license. According to the Federal Registry, you just signed an assumption of liability document for a highly contaminated chemical dumping ground. The mandatory cleanup cost is estimated at $2 million. Because you personally guaranteed the estate transfer, the federal government has seized your financial assets to cover the environmental penalty. You are completely bankrupt, sir. I am so sorry." The line went dead. The silence that followed was the heaviest, most suffocating silence I had ever experienced. Jamal stood frozen, his arms still holding the disconnected phone to his ear. His jaw hung open. The flashy gold watch on his wrist suddenly looked like cheap, heavy chains. The $1 million real estate flip, the glorious suburban estate, the arrogant boasting, it all evaporated into thin air. He had not just inherited a toxic house. He had handed the federal government the legal right to strip him of every single penny he had ever earned. Megan stared at her husband, her eyes wide with absolute horror. She slowly stood up, her designer handbag slipping from her shoulder and crashing onto the floor. "What did he say?" Megan whispered, her voice trembling violently. "Jamal, tell me what he just said. Did he say all of our money is gone?" Jamal could not speak. He just slowly lowered the phone, his eyes staring blankly at the floor. Megan completely lost her mind. She let out an ear-piercing shriek and lunged at him. She began hitting his chest with her fists, screaming at the top of her lungs. "You idiot!" she sobbed hysterically. "You arrogant, stupid idiot! You told me the government could not sue us. You said you were a genius. You just lost our entire life savings for a pile of toxic dirt. We are ruined." Jamal did not even try to stop her. He just stood there completely broken while his wife screamed in his face. The dominoes were finally falling, crushing them under the exact weight of their own limitless greed. Beatrice let out a weak, ragged wheeze. Her manicured hands flew to her chest, clutching the expensive fabric of her white-tailored suit. Her knees gave out and she collapsed heavily back into the hard wooden chair. The commanding matriarch who had spent her life terrorizing everyone around her was completely gone. In her place sat a fragile, broken woman who suddenly looked every single day of her 65 years. She stared at the polished mahogany table, her eyes completely vacant. She realized she had not just lost her imaginary inheritance, she had lost her pristine reputation, her luxury lifestyle, and every single penny she had hoarded over her lifetime. Richard did not offer her a glass of water. He did not offer a word of legal counsel or comfort. The corporate shark knew exactly when there was blood in the water, and he knew when a client was a dead end. With swift, practiced movements, he grabbed his legal pad and the red-stamped folder, shoving them carelessly into his imported leather briefcase. He snapped the brass locks shut with a sharp click. Beatrice weakly reached out a trembling hand, pleading for him to help. Richard simply shook his head, pulling his arm away. "I am sorry, Beatrice," Richard stated, his voice devoid of any professional warmth. "But I bill at $800 an hour. I do not work for free, and I certainly do not work for bankrupt clients." You are on your own." Without another word, Richard turned his back on the woman he had just helped destroy. He sprinted down the center aisle of the courtroom, pushing open the heavy oak doors and vanishing into the hallway forever. At the other end of the table, Jamal and Megan were consumed by their own nightmare. Megan was still sobbing uncontrollably, her tears ruining her expensive makeup and dripping onto her designer clothes. Jamal stood frozen, staring blankly at the wall, unable to process the absolute magnitude of his failure. They had spent their lives trying to steal the success of others instead of building their own. Now they were chained together in a permanent prison of toxic debt and federal liens. I stood at the petitioner's table and watched the absolute wreckage of my in-laws. A year ago, I might have felt a fleeting moment of pity. I might have tried to negotiate a way out for them, but not today. They conspired to throw me and my 5-year-old daughter out onto the street just hours after my husband died. They questioned my daughter's paternity and mocked my grief. They demanded my absolute destruction. I simply gave them exactly what they asked for. I did not smile. I did not gloat or offer any final cutting remarks. They were already living in their own personal hell, and my words could not add anything to their punishment. I calmly reached down and picked up my black wool coat, slipping it over my shoulders. I picked up my sleek leather briefcase and turned to David. My lawyer was still sitting there looking at me with profound awe and deep respect. He stood up and offered me a small knowing nod. I turned away from the table and walked down the center aisle. My heels clicked rhythmically against the floor, carrying me away from the chaos. I pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the quiet marble hallway. My trusted babysitter was sitting on a wooden bench near the elevators, holding Lily on her lap. When Lily saw me, she jumped down and ran down the hallway, her little sneakers squeaking on the polished floor. I dropped my briefcase and knelt, catching her in a massive hug. I buried my face in her soft hair, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo. The heavy burden I had been carrying for weeks finally lifted from my shoulders completely. I stood up, took my daughter's small hand in mine, and walked out the front doors of the courthouse. The bright, warm New York sun washed over us instantly, banishing the cold shadows of the past. Sometimes the greatest revenge you can ever achieve does not require yelling or fighting. Sometimes the most powerful thing a woman can do is set an absolute boundary, step aside, and let greedy, toxic people completely destroy themselves with their own momentum. You never have to accept the roles they try to force you into. Thank you so much for listening to my story. If you have ever had to walk away from a toxic situation to protect your peace, please leave a comment below and share your experience. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories about resilience and boundaries. Remember, your worth is never defined by the people who fail to see it. Stay strong. One of the most profound lessons we can take away from Claire's journey is that true power does not always roar. Society often conditions us to believe that when we are wronged, we must fight back loudly, matching the aggression of our abusers blow for blow. We are taught to desperately cling to what is ours, especially when toxic family members try to strip it away. But Claire's story beautifully illustrates the strategic brilliance of simply walking away. The core lesson here is that greed is the ultimate blinder. When dealing with deeply narcissistic and toxic people like Beatrice and Jamal, their absolute obsession with superficial wealth and dominance makes them incredibly vulnerable. They are so focused on winning the prize and defeating you that they completely forget to look for the trap. By refusing to engage in their toxic tug of war, Claire did not show weakness. She demonstrated ultimate emotional control. She realized that engaging with a rigged system only drains your own energy. Sometimes the most devastating response to greedy people is handing them exactly what they demand and letting their own malicious momentum pull them over the cliff. In our own lives, we often exhaust ourselves trying to prove our worth to family members who are committed to misunderstanding us. We fight over petty inheritances, titles, or simply the last word. Claire teaches us that true victory is found in protecting our peace and our boundaries above all else. Stepping aside and letting toxic people consume themselves is not a surrender. It is a masterclass in self-preservation. Your mental health is worth far more than any house or bank account. If you are ready to stop fighting battles that cost you your peace, share this story with someone who needs to hear it and subscribe for more empowering content.